Hi, I'm Nancy Eigelmiller, and I'm the Executive Director of One in Five. And today we're with Dr. Michael Sorter, who is the Director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Sorter.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here with you again today.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about anxiety and depression and some questions that have been posed to us by some parents that we work with. So the first question is, you talk about anxiety in a very generic fashion. Can you explain what signs we should be aware of that is really an anxiety disorder?
Well, anxiety disorders can appear in many different ways, but oftentimes probably the most common things that you see is really a child who perhaps is like not engaging in activities as much as they used to, or they may have like an underlying fearfulness that is becoming more prominent. And then I think there can be, along with the avoidance, there can actually be periods of like panic, where someone has an anxiety attack, if you will, where they kind of have a breakdown of their kind of coping skills and maybe become tearful or cry or become, struggle with engaging in an activity or with people. Anxiety disorders can be a lot of different things, whether it's avoidance of social interactions, whether it's panic episodes, whether it's school refusal, which is very common. And they can also, there's other forms of anxiety where people can become more obsessive about things.
Can you talk a little bit about the progression of an anxiety disorder?
Anxiety disorders oftentimes go years undetected. So the idea that they're around for a while and progress is really right on target. And oftentimes, maybe years before kids get into treatment, that's what we want to avoid. We want to get them in earlier. And so important to talk about it like we are today, so that, help can be kind of obtained for these young people, because treatment can really work very well. So oftentimes it just begins pretty innocently with some avoidance or some expressed worries or anxieties that are discussed, or just that basic fearfulness. And then where you see it progress is where kids begin kind of disengaging from the expectations that oftentimes would be part of normal development, whether it's being off with friends, whether it's being away from home, whether it's going to school on a regular basis, whether it's having excessive kind of things such as aches and pains and things of that nature that may come up. When you see those things begin to emerge into a pattern, that's when you should really start having some concerns. That could be depression or anxiety or depression. It might be interfering with the child engaging in their usual activities.
How might we know the difference between a situation that is causing an anxiety and an anxiety disorder?
Probably are normal situations that provoke anxiety. So a child who's going to be in a play or is going to pitch a game that day or have to get up in front of the class and present. Those would be all, situations where we could anticipate feeling nervous, worried, maybe even want to avoid it. So those would be situations. Where we get into more normal situations that really kind of project anxiety that stops us from doing things, that's when it's more of an anxiety disorder. But someone with an anxiety disorder is going to have that same response, but maybe an exaggerated one to some of those anxious situations. So again, is anxiety probably to some degree is a little bit healthy, because it does make us a little bit wary about certain things. And so many of these emotions are on a continuum. And so it's when it begins interfering with really our normal daily expected activities and duties is when we need to be thinking that it's more of a disorder.
Let's talk a little bit about depression. Is there a certain age where you start to see depression develop in youth? I know that we talk about the statistic all the time. By the age of 14, 50% of mental illnesses surface. By the age of 24, 75. Does that also hold true with depression?
Depression can begin earlier in life, but it is more prominent as children get older, with the adolescents having more depression typically than diagnosable depression than we see in younger children. However, depression and anxiety can be very prominent in younger people. And some of the anxiety disorders we see very early in life, oftentimes those are kids that maybe have more of a kind of a predisposition for depression in adolescence. There's perhaps a lot of overlap oftentimes between some of the symptoms between the two major kind of disorders there. So I think that we can see kids as, who are in grade school, early grade school, have depression. And then even depression, even in younger children, oftentimes who have been in traumatic experiences and things of that nature. So it really can begin very early in life. It may manifest itself differently. It may earlier on be disruptive behavior or decreased engagement with others. Someone older may be able to talk about feelings of dysphoria and sadness, where maybe that's not as available to younger children who can't really put those feelings into words.
Language, right? Talk a little bit more about that. We talk a lot about emotions for young kids, and I think that we're seeing it a lot right now after the pandemic, that we're seeing a lot of anger being expressed, and that's really that start of depression in young children. So when you're looking at by age, are there certain things that parents should be looking for?
With the pandemic and the stress is really almost emotional regulation. Which might be a little bit of a different perspective than depression in itself. Because really being in some of those social situations such as school and around peers and the classroom and teachers and then back at home with family, we're always kind of almost rehearsing ways to kind of regulate ourselves. Part of it is the expectations that are set, but we learn from our others. And when we're isolated from that and all of a sudden thrown back into it, that a lot of times can cause disruption. And so, and out of that disruption can kind of come frustration, anger, upset. Things to really kind of think from a parental perspective is, again, to go back to the idea of how do I kind of facilitate my kid being able to, my child being able to kind of function the best they can at school. Make them feel comfortable at home sharing the feelings that they have. And kind of giving them that positive affirmation of, that you're there for them and will help support them as they're going through this tough time.
So as a parent, are there certain symptoms that I should be aware of, that I should be looking for and be concerned about?
Well, for depression itself, is the biggest thing would be is, again, kids, well, some kids, older children will tell you that they feel sad. Many young people can. So when you see kind of diminished pleasure in their usual activities and interests, so they start withdrawing from friends or withdrawing from activities or struggling at school. Problems with attention can kind of happen with depressions. Those school problems can come up. Problems with energy level. Their energy is less or they're less active. Problems with kind of even eating in some classes or for some young individuals where they might lose weight or not gain weight like they should be. And then I think in the most severe things, of course, where not only talks about sadness, but talks about, feelings of like inappropriate guilt or feelings of worthlessness. And then, of course, if there's any thoughts about self-harm or suicide. So, and the other thing would be, as a parent, it's okay to ask about those things. And that's why establishing those relationships where we can talk pretty openly about how you're doing is so very important.
So do you think there's a certain age where it's appropriate to start having a conversation about mental health, suicide, that type of discussion?
Well, my sense would be is mental health discussions can really take on an informal way very early in life.
Ground zero.
Really, exactly. I mean, it's how are you doing? What's going on? How was it with your teacher today? Are you having fun? The idea of a child not having fun tells you a lot.
Yeah.
I think those discussions about how doesn't have to be put in the terms of mental health. It's just in terms of, how are you satisfied with where you're doing right now?
Right.
Are you, because most kids are kind of happy. They want to do well and they want to please others.
Right.
And so getting involved with those kind of very basic conversations is very helpful.
And what about the suicide? When do you think it's appropriate to talk about that?
Well, my thought would be is that really, if your child is having any types of struggles early on, I mean, just to be straight up, if you have that concern, it's okay to ask. There's no evidence at this point where it does any harm. The recommendations from like pediatrics and psychiatry is that really screening in adolescence is indicated.
Hmm.
And so that's from a professional side.
Right.
From a parent's point perspective, my sense would be is if, is to ask how people are doing, ask about sadness. And if you have any concerns, is of course ask about, what are the, if you have any bad thoughts or any thoughts
Right.
about self-harm. So I think if you have that concern, there's really no harm in asking.
And asking. Okay. That makes sense. My child seems sad, depressed lately, but is reluctant to go to the doctor or therapist about it. Is there something we as a family can do to help her?
Well, I would suggest going with them. When you work with a therapist, for most young people, it's with the family. Now, there are certain therapists that only want to work with the child,
Hmm.
but you go as a family. And so I know most of the young people that I see are with their parents.
Okay.
And so a lot of times the kids they don't want me to be talking just to their parents.
Yeah.
So, but the therapy can actually happen in the room. And I think so often is that really oftentimes the most important part of therapy I'm doing is really helping the parents with their responsiveness to their child, because they're there, every day of the week, and helping them kind of give that positive reinforcement to their child is probably the most important therapeutic thing that can happen.
So let's go to the other end of the spectrum where somebody is just flat out, I am not going to therapy. I am okay. I don't need help. What kind of recommendations do you give to parents?
Well, again, then I suggest they go.
Okay.
And really, so much of what we see with a lot of they're the healing instrument, oftentimes much more than the therapist is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and those can be very tough situations with someone who kind of digs their heels in and all that. Well, even kids with like oppositional defiant traits and things like that, it's really parent management training that's been shown to kind of make the most difference.
Mm-hmm.
So if you'd love for them to go with you, and hopefully you can get to the point where they will. On the other hand, is going you as a family, because if you're in that kind of situation, it's not only stressful for the individual young person, but also the family.
Yeah, exactly.
And it takes a toll,
Mm-hmm.
and it causes distancing.
Right.
And that's the last thing you really want.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. Did I miss anything that you think parents need to know in this space?
Again, for depression and anxiety, the major issues would be is sometimes it's very hard for us to understand why a young person could feel sad when most of us work very hard to kind of really enrich their lives. They go to a good school, they may have things that they need at home. You're there at home with them, but sometimes they can still feel sad.
Mm-hmm.
And as parents, a lot of times we project our own feelings onto our young people. So we're pretty happy, they must be happy. That may not be the truth. And so that's why really having that relationship and having that ability to kind of have an open discussion is so very important, because you may not exactly know how they're feeling.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us today.
All right, my pleasure. And it's always fun.
Yes. All right.